Hi and welcome to this bite-sized video on making the difference for GCSE Maths. In this video we're going to focus on what it takes to progress from grade 5 to grade 6. So I thought it'd be useful just to start off by looking at that kind of overall performance. So on screen here you can see colour-coded the average performance on each question by students who went on to achieve each grade. And it kind of follows the distribution we'd expect to see, where we get almost this diagonal pattern as their performance starts to kind of fall off, and fewer students are getting marks as we go further into the more challenging questions towards the end of the paper. We get some obvious exceptions. So, for example, where a question's performed particularly poorly has been challenging for the whole cohort. So on here, for example, question 9b, or has actually been performed kind of maybe better than expected. So, for example, question 11d here. In terms of general themes, what we see for performance at grade 6 is that on those crossover questions, which on here is up to question 7, the performance is broadly comparable to those at grade 5 or a little bit better. We don't see massive differences at this stage. As we'd expect, the the big difference that we start to see is in the middle of the paper here. This is where our grade 6 students start to kind of achieve significantly more of the marks than the grade 5 counterparts. What we also see is that some grade 6 students are able to score some marks even in the hardest questions towards the end of the paper. So moving on to what we're going to look at next is we're going to be really interested in where are the biggest gaps of performance between grade 6 and grade 5 students, and start to investigate if there are any themes in this. And we do this by looking at the performances across all papers for all the June series, so leaving out the November ones here because obviously that's a fairly skewed cohort. So on screen here we've got a summary of that analysis, and so these are the themed kind of topic areas we see significant differences in the grade 6 performance compared to their grade 5 counterparts. And as a bit of a caveat, this is just simply a list of topics that grade 6 students have been more successful with than their grade 5 students based on all that past performance data we have. So use this really as an indication of which topics your students who are targeting grade 6 could and should be experiencing some success in. So these are useful areas to target. Looking through this, limits of accuracy and bounds, this was especially where there was a division involved. The basic work simplifying surds. Within the algebra work, iteration might be a surprising one there, but what we see is that grade 6 students can experience success substituting into formulae to work out the first few terms. So that is an area that they can do successfully. Within our geometry section here, sine and cosine rule. So grade 6 students are showing that they can get started with these questions, whereas grade 5 students are really struggling to even make a start. And that's likewise with the arcs and sectors. See, grade 6 students not necessarily being able to complete the full question, but they probably can identify that they need to use either sine or cosine rule and make an initial substitution, make a start on the problem. In terms of the probability, I've noted here just harder questions. So this is usually where the events might be dependent upon one another, or it's a harder probability that they're working out, such as the probability that they lose at least one game. So this may be just a little bit more interpretation they've got to do there. And on screen here, just a couple of questions that have really big performance differences on them, just as examples to illustrate the type of questions that we're talking about. So now let's look at resources. So we've got higher tier theme practice papers. These are practice papers by topic, and on screen there I've highlighted some key topics that could be useful to support progress to grade 6. You can find all of those within that higher tier theme papers cabinet on the Maths Emporium. And another thing I really want to mention here is calculator use, and specifically to plan to dedicate significant lesson time to explicitly teaching some key calculator skills. We're going to look at those now. So key calculator skills at higher tier, the usual, making sure that you use the fraction button, square root buttons effectively to input calculations in one go. Using the answer button effectively is really key skill to avoid prematurely rounding in those multi-step calculations and losing those accuracy marks, and also in performing iteration calculations. And with iteration, students really need that focus on a clear method. So getting them to show the initial substitution, get them to write out the equivalent formula with the ans in place of the x term. Write down each term clearly labelled, so x0 equals x1 equals x2 equals, etc. So giving them a really clear structure to make sure that they can do those substitutions successfully. The table function, I was a massive fan of this. It's really easy for your students to use once you've got them kind of trained up in it. And as well as generating a table of values, for example, for plotting a quadratic, they can also use it to generate sequences, check their nth term rule. That's particularly helpful if they've worked out the nth term for a quadratic. And also just to learn about the general behavior of a function that they might be unfamiliar with. So determine the general shape of a graph, and that can be really helpful if they've got maybe a question on something like sketching a reciprocal function. So they can use the calculator to give them some clues, to give them some guidance in those scenarios. They need to be fluent, obviously, in using the trig functions and their inverses, and using their calculator to check answers. So substituting values back into the original equation to check it's a valid solution. And we've already mentioned about how we could use things like the table function to check our nth term for a quadratic sequence. We've got our aiming for grade 6 practice papers. These are 30-minute tests with student-friendly mark schemes. It's perfect to do and mark in one lesson. And then the last resource I really want to highlight, and this is one of my favourites, is our Exemplar materials. Now, this is a PowerPoint where we've taken some of the key questions from a previous series, and it's got the mark schemes there, it's got the examiner comments, it's got exemplar student responses and how they were marked and why. So this is an amazing resource to teach students how to understand how marks are allocated, and in turn to develop a better understanding of how multi-step problems are broken down. So a really good way to use these in class. And it's a PowerPoint with lots of stage reveals, so it makes it really easy to use. Show them the blank question and get them to have a go at it, or you could be using this as a follow-up to their attempt in a mock exam script. Then get them to predict what they think the marks are going to be for. So it's a 3-mark question. What do we think the mark scheme is going to look like? Then we're going to mark it using the mark scheme. If they didn't get full marks, get them to explain why. So what did they need to do differently? We can discuss the examiner notes as a class, show them the student exemplars then. So these are the exemplars taken from scripts, obviously anonymised, of actual student work, and get them to become the examiner. So maybe get them to work in groups and mark each response, and then to present to the wider group, what mark did they award and why? If they didn't give someone the mark, why not? What did they need to do? So a really nice follow-up from that analysis of using the exemplars is to then get them to attempt the equivalent question from the shadow papers to consolidate that learning. So we've really analysed, we've marked our own work, we've analysed some student exemplars, we've discussed it. Now can we bring together everything that we've learned to have a go at the shadow paper question, the equivalent one, and make sure that we've really understand how to complete that successfully, and hopefully then achieve full marks. This video is part of your Subject Advisor support from Pearson. I'm Vicky, your Subject Advisor for Maths and Statistics, and on screen you can see all of the different ways that you can get in touch with me if you'd like any further support.